Yeah. Anyway, let's not get into all
Yeah.
of that. So, but it's been a while. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for coming. Welcome, everybody. Sunday evening. I am Shaukat Majumdar. I know many of you who are here. I teach English and creative writing at Ashoka. And it's my great delight to introduce what is actually our first event of the new academic year. And as it goes on forever, we don't get to do physical events, but this is the flip side is we can get people from everywhere. So it's my great delight to have here my colleague, Amit Chaudhuri. He also teaches creative writing in our department. Someone whose work I've been reading for many years now, early fiction, non-fiction, poetry, a very fine critical mind, a very essayistic mind. And what we are going to talk about today is, two of his books which bring together many of these different interests. One is his book on something he has been pursuing for a long time, music, Finding a Raga. He has a binding interest in lifelong relationship with Hindustani classical music. It's a really interesting book. We were just using the word flaneur, and flaneur like it wanders between thoughts on music, the writer's life. There's so many things in it. For somebody an outsider to Hindustani classical music, it was really enriching. And we're going to talk about that book and also another more recent book of poems, Ramanujan, which I actually haven't had a chance to see yet, but looks very, very exciting in every way. And I'm really glad that Keshav Guha actually accepted our invitation to come and have this conversation with him. Keshav, I think Keshav, we last met also in a literary festival just before the pandemic, the
Right.
Matribhumi
Yeah.
Literary Festival, right? So everything feels like pre-pandemic and post-pandemic now. Keshav is a commentator on literature, politics. He's written a highly regarded first novel, An Accidental Magic. Has much to do with Harry Potter admiration, so that's a real draw. And I believe he also is a editor at large with Juggernaut Publishing House. So he does many things. He writes many different kinds of things, and we really couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation with. So, Keshav, a very warm welcome to Ashoka, virtually, of course. And I'll now leave it to you and just melt into the audience. So, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaukat. Thank you, Amit. It's a great privilege to be in conversation. So we're gonna use these two recent books also perhaps as a way of developing some broader themes across the, I suppose now over 3 decades of Amit's career as an imaginative writer, to use his own phrase. And I want to start, Amit, with a question about the kind of your body of work or your career as a whole. I've been, I mean, I think I haven't read everything you've written, but I have read a range of things from your very early work, sort of early poems, your first two novels, to the most recent poems and novels, criticism over the decades. And when I think of your work, I mean, some adjectives that come to mind would be personal, singular, in a sense, even, and I'll develop what I mean here, stubborn. So the reason I think of that word stubborn is when I look around fiction and English, both in India and globally, over the last few years, maybe over the last few decades, one of the dominant literary modes, maybe the dominant mode, is careerism. People who seem to be reverse engineering fiction to fit what an agent might like, or an editor might like, or what they think an agent or an editor might like, or what the Booker Prize might like. And I'm not blaming people. It's a difficult world. It's difficult to get published. It's difficult to make a living and all of that. But these seem to me compulsions that you have managed for 35 years now to stubbornly resist. You seem to be, one of the only writers I can think of who has, with every single book, seemed to just pursue a personal artistic vocation or mission. So I suppose I want to ask you if you think this is a fair characterization, and also, how have you managed to pull it off? Is it some inner self-belief? Is it luck? Is it a combination of these qualities?
Okay, Keshav, thank you for that sort of view, that perspective on on what I've been up to. And I'm trying to, yeah, I see what you're saying, and I also like your use of the word stubborn. Why should not one bring in such a word to describe a particular kind of creative activity? So I'm now really thinking seriously about, I mean, it's not as if I haven't thought about this before. I think about it constantly.
Yeah.
I think about it constantly because I would rather be part of things. You know, I am somebody who keeps to myself in, you know, socially, and also as a, in terms of my writerly choices, but not necessarily because I want to. You know, I would rather be, gregarious and a part of things. I've tried to figure out what I've been up to and why I have never been a part of things and never wanted to be a part of things. Why, for instance, I never felt a great connection with what came to be known as, you know, the Indian novel in English, or Indian writing in English. I mean, so I began to write my first novel in 1986. So, but even when I was writing that first novel, I did know that I was turning against something. Primarily, I was turning against myself.
Yeah.
So until then, or until the early 80s, I was still very much working my way through being the kind of adolescent I'd been, a person who had grown up in the 70s, around whom was the body of thought and writing we called existentialist writing, or absurdist writing. You know, the word absurd was in currency, just as the word diversity is in currency right now. And you know, as I've written about this before, it played into my own teenage angst and my sense of apartness from the world. And I would view Beckett through that lens, and I would valorize Beckett through that lens, and I would view T.S. Eliot through that lens, and I would valorize him through that lens. When I went to watch a film by Ingmar Bergman, I would again see the same kind of, the replay of the same kind of thing. But a time came when I realized I wanted to step out of myself. You know, I found this kind of penumbra of the self, which is what also I interpreted in my teenage way as the existential experience. I wanted to get out of it. I think the change began to come to me after I'd been in England and I'd returned to Bombay and to St. Cyril Road, where my parents had moved. And the change there was I'd spent time in England, and I'd discovered a form of existence where there were no sounds. Forget about the weather. You know, one was enclosed, as it were, not only within the room, but within oneself. So one could hear one's own thoughts. So, and just opening a window and hearing sounds being able to come in assumed a great significance for me. And the other thing is, my parents, after my father retired, moved to St. Cyril Road to a third-story apartment. So I'd grown up on the 12th story and the 25th story. So again, the first kind of startling experience I had then was being woken up by bird call at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I hadn't properly heard bird call at that time of the day before, because you couldn't hear it in those apartments. And it was it was almost a terrifying cacophony, but it moved me, I think, greatly in retrospect. My ability to hear the proximity of that life, and I thought to myself, I must escape from the self into the street. And that is what A Strange and Sublime Address became about. And so somewhere I thought, I don't want to write a novel of character. I don't want to write a novel of interiority. I want to escape these things into a scattering of meaning, of other things. So I was turning against myself, first of all, Keshava. So the existentialism, that experience, absurdist theater and drama and even novels, just that ethos, misunderstood by a teenager, is what I was then trying to leave behind. The Midnight's Children, which had come out, I think, 5 years before I began to write my first novel, was still not, I knew it had come out, but it didn't figure in my consciousness to that extent. I knew there was somebody called Salman Rushdie. He had won something called the Booker Prize. Fair enough. At that time in 1986, it hadn't become the mass hallucination. It has become now. I mean, no way was it near even becoming that kind of fetishized obsession, a way of defining what goes on in writing, while not actually engaging with writing, that it has become now. It was there. I had heard about it, so it didn't exercise me. But of course, gradually over time, I became aware that there was this new kind of novel emerging now from India. And actually, a little bit further into my writing, I realized that, oops, I'm not part of this. And this I became further aware of from some of the responses I was getting. When A Strange and Sublime Address came out and Afternoon Rag came out, some of the responses in India, not so much in the UK. It's not as if in the UK they were saying, this is a great Indian novel, we like it because it tells us everything about India. That was not their response. Their response had to do with other things. But in India, there was some bafflement, especially about Afternoon Rag. So I realized I'm not part of things. But however, I also knew that given the history, let us say, of Bengali literature or the practice of someone like Anantamurthy or Bashir, that the kind of stuff that I was doing should not have been that alien to a literary audience. So then I was trying to figure out, why don't I fit in here? What is happening here? What is going on right now? Where are my connections then? And this begins to kind of impel me towards finding out in what way I am situated, or what way my practice is situated, and why I'm compelled to take the position I'm taking. And that leads to me sort of finding my way. It's kind of groping my way through, but also with a degree of stubbornness, as you put it.
It's there's so much to pick up on that. So essentially, you mentioned Midnight Children, which I was going to bring up, because by the late 90s, I think Midnight Children and Rushdie loomed in a way that I'd imagine that, I'm about a decade or so older than your students, but I'd imagine that he doesn't, and that book and that author don't loom in the same way imaginatively as they did then. But there were, I think, at least two obvious ways in which by the late 90s, your practice or your career were at odds with the sort of trend. The first is, the Salman Rushdie, both in his fiction, but more than that in his essays, he argued that his way of writing about India was the way to write about India. And famously, he said, you can't write cool Fosterian fiction about India because India is hot and India is loud and so on and so forth. And secondly, you sort of were the editors of the two prominent anthologies of modern Indian writing that came out a few years apart. And notoriously, Somerset and Elizabeth West's book all but excluded Indian language or regional language writing. And when your Picador book comes out a few years later, it has more writers who are translated into English than writers who are writing in English. But I don't want to dwell on that too far, because I also wanted to, I think the really fascinating thing that you talk about is turning against yourself, because in Finding the Raga, you at some length discuss a different experience, an earlier experience, if anything, of turning against yourself, which is as a teenager, you're writing effectively folk songs. You're an admirer of Joni Mitchell, of Neil Young, and you've got your guitar and you're writing folk songs, and then you have a kind of conversion experience, and for the rest of your life you've been singing khayal pretty much every day. Now, there was a turning against yourself, I'd imagine, there, but I think over time, I suspect that your listening as well as your musical practice have come to incorporate the earlier self that was turned against, as well as the self that was turned to. Is that fair?
Yeah. In both the case of music and of writing and of experiencing, let us say, imaginative works. So just to go back to that thing about turning against myself, I remember when I began to write A Strange and Sublime Address. So I went and bought an accountant's register. So I was in my parents, as I said, were in St. Cyril Road. I was visiting them at that time. I was an undergraduate at University College London. So I went and bought this register because it seemed long. I asked them for something I could write in. This is what they gave me. I remember the name was Jagruti, and I began writing in it. One of the first things I wrote at the back, I can't remember the exact words, but one of the first things was that however multifarious the imagination might be, it cannot rival the multifariousness of reality. So over there, I was already stating to myself my investment in life over everything else. I was putting my powers of invention at a lower level of interest to myself than life itself. It seemed that I was saying to myself, I needed to be open to it. That's all that I needed, mainly. So that was one of those moments when I was turning against myself, and without knowing it, turning against also this kind of novel. Rushdie is a wonderful writer and a great essayist, so I don't want to sound as if I'm complaining against him, but we are only talking about him because we are talking about that time. And as I said, he did not loom large, and later he began to loom larger. And not just him. I think he's a terrific writer, but a particular understanding of the novel with him began to loom large. And there, with that novel, the kind of the capacity for a particular kind of outrageous invention was seen to be somehow to be authentically part of this extraordinary land.
Yeah.
While I was saying that to myself that, it's the everyday that's in front of us that actually is more surprising than anything that that my imagination might produce. So now, when then I was mentioning the Bergman, Beckett, as people I had to leave, or the way of thinking about them was a way of thinking I had to leave behind in order to begin. And now when I go back, or now, not now, but in the last 20 years or 25 years, when I go back to Beckett or when I go back to Bergman, I find them full of humor and full of life. So this is the old self being rethought finding a new voice, seeing with new eyes what it had adored once and then rejected.
Yeah.
But finding new reasons for adoration. These reasons for adoration are more continuous with the opening of one's eyes to life, to what I call multifariousness. That multifariousness, which I didn't have time for before, or the eyes for before, later on I found that multifariousness in Bergman and in Beckett. It was a myth that they were absurdist and dour and stark. They were not. Now, with the American or Canadian, whatever, folk song, I think I was, I kind of practiced in that mode a form of music on my own terms. I don't think if you listen to those songs in an album which I've released now called 17, that I'm trying to be somebody else. That I'm trying to be Joni Mitchell or Neil Young in any of those songs. But I certainly was blissfully sort of inhabiting the world of the singer-songwriter or the American singer-songwriter. And then as I began to discover Hindustani classical music, and not only discover my own attraction to it, I then had to reject that self. A turn happened, and for 16 years I stopped listening to those records and to that music and playing the guitar. So yes, there was a turn again against the self. But then after 16 years, I embarked on a project called This Is Not Fusion, which was a direct outcome of my mellowing towards my older self and beginning to listen to my old record collection. And then while singing Rag Todi, hearing the notes of the riff to Leila by Derek and the Dominos in some of the notes that I was singing. So a kind of bridge, but in a way that I would not have anticipated, did come into existence between these selves.
So I wanted to ask a very quick question before coming back to some of the things you said, which is you've written that singing is actually the opposite of self-expression, because it's the note rather than the self that is being brought to the fore. Would you say that this sort of singer-songwriter style, that was a form of self-expression, versus when you're singing Rag Todi, then it's the self that's being sort of repressed? What would you?
I don't think when I sing the Rag Todi, I'm repressing the self.
Yeah.
I become immersed in those notes and the progression of those notes. I'm not trying to give you my view on those notes. I become immersed in them. And when I was a singer-songwriter, perhaps I thought that I was expressing myself, but I was expressing myself about emotions which I had sort of experienced by proxy, as it were. Experiences like love. I had no object of love. And that kind of sort of came in handy at a time when it seemed to converge with what I was beginning to first hear of bhajans and thumris. Where there was this kind of wavering line between profane love and sacred love. And people seem to be sort of madly in love with non-existent beings. Mira's love for Krishna, for instance. So me writing these songs about love without having actually about the pain of love, the betrayal of love, being ignored by the person one adored, was a teenage self speaking, but it was also not. It gave me a new perspective on, devotional songs gave me a new perspective on this kind of experience, because those devotional songs were also about being made to wait by or being ignored by an object of adoration who was a deity, who was non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, with Meera, that whole play of the fact that the deity is non-existent in some sense comes into play more acutely because, you know, she's married. She's actually married, but she says she's married to somebody else. And one can imagine her family, however much they believed in Krishna, raising their eyebrows at this other object of devotion. So, you know, self-expression, but what was that self? I mean, it hadn't experienced anything. Well, I'm talking about the guitar playing self.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it had, you know, in A Strange and Sublime Address, but also in other works of yours, you do return from time to time to the view of the child, and the child is certainly experiencing as well as observing and taking in. But I wanted to come back to things that you said earlier about life, this being surprised, this life being more surprising, because I do think this is another train that runs through your work. James Wood said of Afternoon Rag that it's a novel where nothing happens, but everything is at stake. And in a later essay on a couple of years ago, I think in the Earlier Review of Books, you talked about this idea of us all being storytellers now. And you pointed out that this privileges storytelling over existence, the very life from which stories actually draw. And I wanted, so the sort of life itself that is privileged in your work, I think it's an interesting tension or relationship between that pursuit of bringing life to the page or to music and the question that you've thought about, I think, as deeply or as extensively as any contemporary writer, which is the relationship between art and mimesis, or between modernism and mimesis. Again, another subject of another one of your essays, and the subject of one of the subjects of Finding the Raga, because Hindustani music is perhaps the least representational form of singing that exists. So if life itself or existence or the surprises of life are the subject of the books, are the books necessarily mimetic, or you know, to people who perhaps haven't read some of your works on this, you know, speak to that.
I didn't get the last bit of your question.
The question is, you know, is there a tension between the ways in which modernism and Hindustani music are non-representational, non-mimetic, and the fact that your own work, but it is also, but there is also an element of mimesis, because the everyday lived life is your subject.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so good to talk about mimesis, but this is Ashoka University, so we should be able to chat about anything. I mean, that there was maybe some students of literature here, but so I see modernism's impulses as non-mimetic.
Yeah.
And I see khayal also as non-mimetic. And I should explain what I mean by that to people. I mean that it's not kind of representing an emotion, you know, any more than, let's say, a picture by Matisse can be sort of reduced to the thing it purports to be representing and how well it represents it, you know, any more than that. The Matisse's impulses seem to always undercut representation. Even he, Keshava, is mimetic to a certain extent. That is, in the sense that he's showing us a rug, he's showing us a table, he's showing us a window. But he is also using whatever equivalent there might be of synecdoche he has available to make these things incomplete or gestural. We understand this is a rug by the presence of certain lines and certain colors. We have to imagine the rest. So of course, a lot of people in the West, traditionally and even now, think that modernism is mimetic.
Yeah.
I mean, where they think that the fracturing that you see in modernism is somehow mimetic of some trauma in Western civilization. And that's why modernism came about at a certain point of time in the early 20th century. But if you go to Tagore in 1895, the fact that that the person who wants to reject mimesis is doing so basically because they want an unfettering to occur. That becomes very clear in his essay on children's nursery rhymes, where he says children's nursery rhymes in Bengali make random associations in a way that is not permitted in adult thought. Yeah. Adult thought does not allow for those random associations, but the person who has composed these rhymes has got away with creating line after line which don't actually follow from one another, and which also capture what he says are random bits of detritus from experience. That's what he says the nursery rhymes are important for, because they're like a net that capture the random bits of detritus. While he says the adult mind is a net that only keeps the important stuff and filters out the rest. So he's not linking it, Keshav, his kind of privileging in 1895, one of the first people to say this outright, privileging of this kind of random association. He's not linking it to some civilizational crisis. He's not saying this fragmenting is happening because our psyches are now damaged. But this mimetic way of reading will become a way of reading modernism too, and it is a very prevalent way of reading it, and it's very widespread. That I'm not so interested in. And with music, as I say in my book, Basant Rag or Rag Purvi have more or less the same notes, but that doesn't make those notes indicative that this is about Basant, the spring, or this is about early evening, Purvi, in a way that, say, the pastoral symphony, the major notes in the major scale in the pastoral symphony are all to be found in the springtime section. It is entirely springtime, but there's a storm, and when the storm happens, the nature of the notes change, and we begin to get more of the minor scale, and thereby a kind of mimesis is set up where the major notes become associated in our mind with the happiness of spring, and the flats of the minor scale become associated in our minds with the impending storm. And what I'm saying is that there are no such parameters of interpretation. In Hindustani classical music, they've thrown those parameters out. So even in my books, I'm busy throwing those parameters out. Even if I describe a room, I mean, the very fact that I spend so much time looking at objects means that I'm taking away from what is usually central to the story, which is the person at the center of it. And this is why my interest in what's ordinarily called background is part of that same turning, that what you call stubbornness, but also part of the wonder that I feel the main protagonist's story is not adequate to addressing. The protagonist's story is not adequate to addressing the wonder that the novel can accommodate if it goes beyond that main story. And that's what what I've been interested in looking at all these years. So in that sense, once you depart from what the main character is thinking about doing or planning to do, you depart from this mimetic model where everything begins to play a part in the story of the main character. So even if you're looking at the object, or if you're describing the object then is in some way connected to the psychological life of the protagonist. I want to release the object from that, and that release is a release for the novel itself.
Yeah, this is actually this is precisely the direction I wanted to go in, because it strikes me, you are someone who writes about objects, about furniture, but not in the Henry James way. It's not firstly, the objects don't have obvious symbolic value. It's not Henry James's golden bowl or what have you, but also I think what it speaks to for me is your very particular distinctive approach to the question of what is important or unimportant. One of the differences between your novel Odysseus Abroad and either the Odyssey or Ulysses is that it isn't in and of itself, in a straightforward sense, an important day in its protagonist's life or in his uncle Radhesh's life. And I also you think about Kingsley Amis famously dismissed Jane Austen by saying that she spends all her time on the unimportant things and no time on the important things. But I think with your work, there actually seems to be a rejection of the distinction, or a rejection of the knowability of what is important and what is unimportant.
No, absolutely. I mean, I have tried my entire life trying to figure out, why important things are not so important to me. I mean, because one is, of course, made to feel guilty about these things ceaselessly. But I do see that it is very, sorry, I'm trying to look for a word other than important, but it's very important for writing, for the space of writing, for the space of art or whatever it is, to realign this question, as to what is important. But that in a way kind of allies it to philosophical stroke spiritual quests, which also try to realign the same thing. Right from the beginning of time. That is a specious kind of formulation, but you know what I'm trying to say. Very early on, when we go back, I mean, some of the most interesting texts that have survived and which are philosophical, spiritual in nature too. That is, I mean, we are now talking about things that precede this domain that we think of as art. But even there, I think a revaluation of what's important, or to quote what you quoted, at stake, what's at stake is being made. A realignment is being made, and so that means there has been that obduracy, that stubbornness going on for a very long time. The stubbornness to do with, well, because obviously we will always fall back on the what we know are the more conventional and therefore valid and legitimate definitions of what's important. We'll always have that. We'll always fall back on those definitions. But there will always be some people who are obdurately realigning or opening up to question what is important. And this is the history of writing itself.
Yeah, and I think one sort of common and probably slightly misleading way of thinking about this is this distinction between high and low. And look, in your new collection of poems, you've got the title poem about Srinivasa Ramanujan, well, recalling Srinivasa Ramanujan through the lens of the unavailability of vegetarian food in Cambridge. And later on, you have a poem about listening to Celine Dion and arguing with your daughter about which Madonna songs, the only Madonna songs you might find listenable. But I don't think it's a high-low point. I think it's just this that I don't think that it's, again, that the lack of salience of the important, unimportant.
Yes, I mean, there is a more or less a consensus at a given point of time about what is important, and also in terms of what to do with forms of knowledge. What is the subject of knowledge? I don't think a geographer will sort of give you something which has no geography in it in a recognizable sense. But writing is different. Art is different. I mean, I might write a poem about a geographer which makes no mention of geography or a geographer. It is possible to do that. So what most forms of knowledge have an object of knowledge, and it's quite clear what that is. And this is also allied to importance, because it is important that a case be made for that particular object of knowledge through that form of knowledge. But what case is being made here in art or in writing? Because obviously the case doesn't have to do with the fixity or the identifiability of a particular object of knowledge or investigation with which the poem or the piece of writing started out as ostensibly being its subject. The subject scatters. We can't even just say that the thing is purely about writing. What's at stake becomes the question, I think, with every piece. And I think we are on the verge of forgetting that. But then, that happens from time to time. Yeah.
In your essay published last year during the early part of the pandemic, Up at Oxford, which was a sort of a response to Simon Cooper's essay in the Financial Times.
Right.
You talk about a class of elite Indian who is sort of being trained at Oxford before coming back to India and to join the media or academia or civil service. And there was a consensus about what was important. And as you say in the essay, philosophy and literature were very much marginalized in that Nehruvian, post-Nehruvian consensus. But one of the things that struck me in that essay, because it links to also Finding the Raga, is you said that one of the things you noticed about those, let's say, people who are either from Delhi or who had passed through Delhi or hoped to move back to Delhi, was that unlike other people at Oxford, they did not, in your phrase, court deferral. And this concept of deferral is, again, very central to Finding the Raga, because it's I should emphasize to people who haven't read the book that the subject of this book is very much not the relationship between your music and your literature, but it is occasionally a theme. And you do say that perhaps something you've learned from Khayal, or that Khayal is inspired in your writing, has been this instinct towards deferral. Just as in Khayal, the alap actually can take up most of the time. It's supposed to be introduction, but it can end up being the main course. The same is true of your work. But one of the things as I was reading Find the Raga that I wondered about was whether something was in fact being deferred. What was in fact being deferred? Because if it seemed to me, both with Khayal and with your work, that climax, culmination, are they being deferred, or are they in fact being rejected? Your books don't have easy or obvious emotional climaxes, and Hollywood film, even a great filmmaker like a Hitchcock or a Billy Wilder or whatever, there is a climax that is emotional or narrative that is being built towards. Same Western popular song, Hindi film song, the chorus refrain is a kind of climax that you build towards and come down from. In your work, I don't know if there is something that is actually being deferred. The process of deferral almost can conceal the fact that every sentence is every sentence is sort of is its own kind of living autonomous thing. In a way that's true of Khayal as well.
So should I respond to that? Okay. how did the whole thing about deferral come up? What was the starting?
Talked about the Delhi students who didn't court
Oh,
deferral.
right. Of course. Yes. Yeah, up at Oxford. I'll touch upon that briefly. I mean, I was speaking about my discovery of Delhi in 1987 in Oxford, and the coming into being of a new elite in India, and I had wanted to write about this for a long time. And Simon Cooper's piece in Financial Times, and I'd met him in Paris. He had invited me to some kind of thing just a few months before that piece came out. And so I was kind of, I immediately remembered him when the piece came out, and I read it, and I thought, well, here he's speaking about the emergence of Boris Johnson and his gang at around the same time in Oxford. But what was happening then in the Oxford that I encountered, and it was this emergence of a new class from Delhi, where two things were assuming a new kind of centrality in my eyes. And one was this particular class from Delhi, and the other one was within the domain of the humanities, the social sciences, and the social science way of looking at the world and understanding the world and verifying the world. And so certain things would be fetishized thereon, history, the nation, and the archive as a kind of holy shrine which you go to verify the authenticity of the past. All of these would then become the gestures which would identify this class. One could not imagine that they spent too much time smoking or in the bathroom. That was not part of what we got to know about them. But those were activities, as you know from my description of Choto Mama in Exchange and Sublime Address, I was interested in as being an important part of the human and intellectual even dance, because Choto Mama sings beautifully in the shower. And
of course, the bathroom comes back with Radhesh in audition.
It does. Yeah. So anyway, I was struck by this class and its particular ambitions, and as you put it, or I may have said that in the piece, it's kind of impatience with deferral, with putting things off, which, in Bombay or in Calcutta, the other city I knew, I mean, the intelligent people always seem to be on a less kind of properly carved out route. We didn't seem to know what they would do next, and we then imitated them. Imitated their habits of distractedness and deferral. We didn't imitate the onward movement. So then later on, I found that there were various reasons why deferral was so important to me. And then, as you say, I spot it as a kind of fundamental creative element in khayal. That every note is a leading note also. In Western music, only the seventh note, which has to then resolve itself in the tonic, upper tonic again, is a leading note. In Indian music, in the progression of khayal, we want resolution with every next note. Therefore, every note through andolan or shruti or microtones is holding back from going to the next note and yet hinting that it might be going to it, And so every note becomes the leading note. And every note, therefore, is involved or complicit in this matter of deferring the progression. So when we say badhat, it kind of indicates development, but actually it also indicates deferral. That is the impeding of development at too quick a pace, too obvious a pace. And this is amazing. This is what makes the music. If it were just development, which is what we often think Bharat is, Bharat theek se nahi kiya. But Bharat theek se nahi kiya means also that the protocols of evasion were not sufficiently observed. It doesn't only mean that the unfolding and what was necessary in terms of disclosure was not disclosed. It doesn't only mean that. It also means that it was, enough evasions to do with disclosure were not, the possibilities of those evasions were not properly followed by the imagination of this interpreter. I first noticed this not very long ago, that is in relation to the book. And I noticed it in a ghazal. That's when I realized that what is going on is deferral. And the ghazal was being sung by Mehdi Hassan, who actually would have been a khayal singer, because he has the temperament of a khayal singer, and this has been said often about him. And some people say it's because he was in Pakistan, where in Zia's regime, or whatever the reasons, that he could not get into khayal, but he brought to ghazal the temper of khayal. But in Kaise Chupao Raze Gham, of which there's a beautiful record as well, but this was a live version which goes on for 27 minutes. Can you imagine? This ghazal is being sung for 27 minutes, and Mehdi Hassan, Kaise Chupao Raze Gham Didaye Tar ko kya karu, and on one of these phrases he just keeps going back to the phrase again and again and again in slightly different ways within the rag, which is Pilu, refusing to go to the next line. And I remember saying to my wife, she was with me at the time, that he's deferring. What he's doing is creating version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, version 5 of that phrase. So he's creating improvisations, but he's doing it because he doesn't want to go to the next phrase. He's kind of testing our patience, but also completely engrossing us in terms of how many variations he can do before he reaches the next phrase, and then what will happen when he reaches it finally. Now, as far as my writing is concerned, you're saying I don't just defer, I reject the idea of a climate.
Books don't have would you accept that your books don't have a telos or a?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly defer or reject showing kind of the central events in the book, more or less. While I was writing Freedom Song, one of the things I had in my mind midway through the book was a piece of street theater, which the young man of the family who had joined the Communist Party in the early 90s was preparing to do on the street in the neighborhood. And then I lead up to it, and I show the rehearsals and I show other things. But then I thought to myself, I just can't show the actual play. I mean, I can't do that. So I just kind of went to the next thing and left the play behind. I discovered another person a great artist who did this, and I was very happy to see that he did. He kind of didn't show the central events, and that is Ozu, the filmmaker.
Yeah. So he Tokyo Story and
Tokyo Story, various late spring, early summer. These are extraordinary films, and he won't show what would in another filmmaker be the main events. Say like a wedding, for instance.
So I'm intrigued by a distinction that you've made in the past between Nehruvian and non-Nehruvian modernity. Would you say that Khayal is a form of non-Nehruvian modernity?
Yeah, it's by which I don't mean kind of ancient and timeless,
or anti-Nehruvian for that matter. I don't think this is some kind of anyway. But you could explain it better. Yeah.
I would say Indian literatures in the Indian languages are contemporaneous and coterminous with Nehru, but are non-Nehruvian. They are part of a. I don't think Nehru is their object, but they're part of objecting to something.
Yeah.
Which Nehru was trying to shape.
Yeah.
So Khayal is a less known part of that tradition because we think of Khayal as being ancient and timeless. But I think it can also be placed in this unfolding, very important tradition in India, where the secular is surprising, disobedient, and has its own idea of what's sacred, which is not necessarily what's important, but is not constitutional. It's not the constitutional idea of the secular that's been given to us. It's a different experience of the secular. So I bring in the word secular because you brought in Nehru to remind ourselves that of the great resources in our artistic traditions of modernity that gave us our secular selves, not the constitution that came much later. I would say in this other kind of opening up of modernity outside of Nehru, Khayal is one of the lesser known sort of explorations, developments, as much as, let's say, Satyajit Ray's films are, or Ritik Ghatak. The Khayal is another one of these.
One of the real contributions of Finding the Raga is to really show this, I think, I think almost irrefutably, the ways in which Khayal is modern, not ancient, modernist, not ancient. And but to your point about the non-Nehruvian nature of what was going on in Indian languages, people, I think, don't realize today the extent to which these different languages also were in interaction with each other. I mean, for example, I've heard from many Tamil writers that Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay's novel Arogya Niketan in Tamil translation was a really foundational text in their understanding of 20th century Indian fiction. And I don't think anybody's reading that book in English translation. One exists, but these conversations, I think, were happening at a greater pace 40 or 50 or 80 years ago than they are today. Now, we only have a few minutes left. I mean, so I wanted to ask you a few sort of quicker, perhaps not quite rapid fire, but a few just quicker questions. So one would be, many people find Khayal intimidating. They don't know very much about it. Is there a way in to Khayal? Is there a gateway drug? How would you meet someone who's 20 years old and they've never listened to Khayal? Where do they begin?
I mean, I first began to make my way towards Khayal through instrumental music, Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar Khan, because, because of the Beatles, everybody was listening to them in Bombay, the people I knew. And an instrumental way, music is a way of getting in because it's easier to listen to in a way that Khayal demands more attention and knowledge. But by now, if we are used to the more forms like the blues, for instance, and if we can bear to listen to somebody playing the blues and singing the blues, and then understanding the tonalities to do with what the blues calls the bent note.
Yeah.
The note that doesn't go tack, 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 but is bent from one to the other, which in India we call, in North Indian music, we call the mead, if one has become used to understanding music not as a tack, 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 tack kind of thing, but as a bending thing, even through the blues, or unknowingly through rock, because rock is based on the blues, then we shouldn't have a problem in understanding those very rich textural tonalities in the best of the singers who sang Khayal. A little bit of poking around will reveal those wonderful voices and timbres.
Okay. very different subject. D.H. Lawrence's poetry or his fiction, which has aged better?
Really rapid fire.
Yeah.
No, they're
The
both.
the answer could be both. I mean,
They're both wonderful. I mean, this, I could talk about it for half an hour at least.
of course, yeah.
But Birds, Beasts, and Flowers,
Yeah.
extraordinary sequence of poems. One of the greatest sequence of poems by an English poet at that time in the English language. Sons and Lovers, an extraordinary modernist book.
Yeah.
And then The Rainbow and Women in Love, a man turning against the lessons he had mastered from modernism early in the day. So he was one of the first modernists in Sons and Lovers. That is, he embraced life. And then he turned against it and he created a different kind of language in Rainbow and Sons and Lovers. He said, less visual. I want less control. My work in Sons and Lovers has been too visual. There is too much control there. Foreseeing Derrida, who draws our attention to the fact that all our tropes of language don't have to do with the senses that collide and therefore cause confusion, but to do with sight, knowledge, illumination. All of these are connected to sight, where we are not in actual contact with what we are coming into contact with. There is a distance there. So he says, we use phrases like, I began to see, all of this kind of perspective. I've got a perspective on this now. All of these are based on tropes to do with seeing. Now, Lawrence presciently, after writing Sons of Lovers, says, it's too visual, there's too much control there. And then he begins to sabotage that idea of control. So an extraordinary writer and thinker.
My question came from the fact that I first encountered Lawrence in school as a poet, and only later on learned that the world thought of him as a novelist. And it always seemed to me that the notoriety of Lady Chatterley had obscured his greatness as a poet. It had led people to think of him as being a kind of the guy who wrote the Portnoy's Complaint of the 1920s, rather than as, sort of this original artist across forms. So got a question from the audience. Before that, I have one last of these rapid fire questions. So these both Khayal music or Hindustani classical music more broadly, as well as the city of Calcutta, are often spoken about as if their prime is in the past. They have declined and they face perhaps a bleak future. Are you sort of, do you have a kind of contrarian optimism about either the future of Khayal music or the future of Calcutta?
I don't have any optimism about anything right now, Keshav, because of the kind of toxic environment in which we find ourselves, where the only satisfactions we can derive are moral satisfactions of having said the right thing, of not having said the wrong word, but Calcutta has the advantage of being neglected compared to other cities. So this is one of the reasons, but it was far more neglected then, why I came back in 1999, because I thought that Britain under Tony Blair and before him Thatcher had homogenized too much. And I thought at least that there is something I might discover in Calcutta. Calcutta it's worrying. Various things are worrying about it. But it is a work in progress. Until people in India and in Calcutta don't see the country and the city as a kind of launch pad to go somewhere else, it's difficult to see what kind of engagement could take place with its spaces. But we have internalized, all of us, including myself, the launch pad mentality, that this is here only to provide us with some kind of the beginnings of a trajectory which will take us elsewhere, which is an extraordinary but maybe finite way of looking at things. I mean, or finite in the sense that maybe it will go. It didn't exist at one time. We did not think of India as a place only to move away from, to begin at, and then to move away from. Maybe it will have a finite history, and then the process of re-engagement will begin, because re-engagement can only come with people who return, people who live, but also people who return, or people who move from other places to a city. With Khayal, the atmosphere, the world is completely moribund, and I was thinking the other day, because I was speaking about this with a Pakistani dancer, and I was thinking maybe it would be nice to bring some Pakistanis on board, bring them to India, or us to go there. I have been there a couple of times. It becomes, by last time I went there in 2018, it was near impossible to find a way of going there. But it would energize things. One of the things we may have lost with partition is a very refined connoisseur class who knew how to respond to things, and you still see that when you go to a place like Karachi or Lahore at a music conference. Not all of it has to do with the fact that they are deprived of the arts and therefore respond with a kind of fulsomeness to make up for it. They have a tradition of response, which Indians seem not to have to that extent. The Brahmanical, I would, identify with the guarded response, with not opening up in generosity when one feels moved by something, to say, God, that was wonderful. But the people in Pakistan don't have that kind of milieu or lineage in terms of the history of response in a particular kind of situation to do with music. So I was thinking, how does one open this up? And I thought maybe this, maybe it's. I'm not saying this in a sentimental kind of fusion idea, but really to reconnect with forms of response which maybe still exist across the border, which were part of our own milieu, which we have lost because of political realities. It's one of the great losses.
I would even add Afghanistan as well as a place where there's actually, a tradition of, people don't realize this, but since Afghanistan is in the news, there's both a tradition and still of some people who are connoisseurs of Indian classical music there. Some years ago, from the Pakistan point, a friend of mine who's an Indian Foreign Service officer, who's a Rasika, sort of showed me a YouTube video, the point of which was, he said, look at the way the audience, it was a concert in Pakistan. He said, I want you to watch the audience and how different now from an Indian audience.
Absolutely. I watched the audience over there. I have wanted to write something about those audiences. I saw them in Lahore during a performance by the Sachal Orchestra, and it was extraordinary, the audience. And I performed there. I sang Hindustani classical in Khayal in Karachi, and it was wonderful. And I have to say, even when I was practicing upstairs in the room in that hotel, the hotel staff, the person who came in to check what's in the mini bar or the fridge, stopped and said to me, "Bahut pyara awaaz hai." I'm sorry to say this, but I'm just kind of sharing this in a sense that this is no longer a response I would get today in India, you know. And then he came up to me and he gave me a little Tetra pack of mango juice as a kind of token of being sort of response. So those audiences remind us of a kind of different way of responding to art in a way that is both open, but open to nuance, open to detail. I think we repress it a lot in our country.
The final question is from the audience, and this is from Sudhanshu Suman. It's a practical question, but I think it's a good one. Okay. It is, how did you achieve your mastery of the English language? Was it from reading or something else? And I'm going to add my own little footnote to the question, which is, would you, is English, how, you know, you're obviously your mother tongue is Bengali. You grew up in a city, a multilingual city, that is Bombay. Has English always been your only first language?
So when I was a child, I mean, my parents only spoke to me in Bangla. We did the same thing inadvertently with our daughter, you know. So my daughter picked up English from friends in the building who are not Bengalis, but belatedly, relatively speaking, by at the time she was 4 or 5. I picked it up around then as well. I got admitted into cathedral school, but I didn't know any English. I knew Bangla and I knew some Hindi because of the people who, you know, worked around the house. And my parents did not think it somehow natural to speak to me in English. And so when I went into, when I was admitted into the school, then I was, my mother was told by the headmistress, who was half English, I remember. Her name was Mrs. Banerjee, so half Bengali, half English. And she was a very kind woman and told my mother, give him Ladybird books to read and comic books to read. And he'll pick it up in about 2 or 3 weeks. And that's what happened. I picked up the language in 2 or 3 weeks, reading about, you know, John and Jane go to the beach or whatever. Mastery, I have no, that I don't know anything.
But I suppose, were you always just a reader?
I was a reader. I read a lot. I read a lot of poetry. Whether
you and your parents switched to English as the sort of the world and conversations became more complex?
No, they spoke in English when they were speaking with people who are not Bengalis. To each other, they spoke in the Sylheti dialect.
Yeah. Right.
They had elected not to they said, there's no point in teaching him Sylheti.
Yeah.
Otherwise, maybe I'd be conversant with that language too.
But speak to any curry house owner in Sylheti.
Yeah, with the curry house owners, I try to, but you know, Sylheti has its own kind of markers of authenticity, which I lack. You know, so I can't pull it off. But so they never really spoke to me in English unless they needed to. They had a wonderful sense of the language. Even my mother, who very much spoke it as a second language. My father did too. My father was of that generation when they learned the language as a second language till they were in class 7 or something like that. But he went on to study and do very well in his first degree in English literature at Scottish Church College in the 1940s. So we're talking about still the colonial era. And in fact, it was from whom I first heard the opening lines of Prufrock, you know, or Shelley, Ode to a Skylark, Ode to the Skylark, I can't remember what the exact title is. He would quote from that poem. And my mother had a great sense of the literary and of Bangla literature, but she had a great sense of English as a language. You know, we forget the fact that speaking or pronouncing words properly or well in English has nothing actually to do with actually knowing the language in a more kind of intimate, nuanced, emotional sense. Yeah, which a lot of those people had who ostensibly spoke it as a second language, while far fewer people seem to have it now. Among those who seem to speak it as a first language in India.
Absolutely. No, I think we're going to have to close, but I think there's a very important point here, which is that Bengal, both Bengal state as well as Bengalis living in other places, I think Malayalis may be the only other community of this kind where bilingualism has really endured in practice. In other parts of India, I say this as somebody, I'm myself a Tamil, but from an English-speaking family, a family that 100 years ago, because of their professional lives in the colonial government, actually switched to English as a first language. My grandparents spoke to each other exclusively in English. And then all living in Delhi, the Punjabis of Delhi are a community that have actually given up their native language and speak Hindi informally and English as a language of commerce and books and so on and so forth. But I think in Kerala and Bengal, the tradition of bilingualism has endured. You have perfect English, but you also continue to speak and read and have another literary and personal life in your mother tongue as well.
I read with difficulty, but I do read. Right now, I'm translating some stuff from Bengali, but because I didn't grow up in Calcutta, I can't read with ease.
Yeah.
That I have to make an effort. But yeah, I mean, certainly I grew up with a deep idea of the importance of Bengali literature, which was also a deeply a modern and contemporary idea. That is that the literature was not being advocated or praised because it represented something utopian or authentic. It just seemed to represent a diversity of thinking and approaches to language, a particular kind of a fertile way of exploring genre and form. This is the reason why my mother and those people seem to admire those novelists, not because they were Bengali, but because what they were doing with the language and the form.
Okay, I think that's a good note for us to end. Finding the Ragas available in all good bookshops. Ramanujan, I think, is not yet available in India.
Not in India, yeah. Next year, we'll talk about that another time. Yes.
One to look forward to, but all of Amit's other books, multiple, because Sweet Shop, I think, is probably the most recent collection of poems that is out in India.
Right.
Friend of My Youth is the most recent novel.
That's right.
And is there another novel on the way anytime soon?
Yes.
Okay, more to look forward to. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed that, Keshav.
And thanks everyone who joined in.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Keshav, for coming in. I really liked the way you brought in. You kind of had a historical sense, but you brought music in the center of the conversation with ideas of rejection, deferral. And I think this was long overdue to kind of bring music into the centerpiece of the discussion of Amit's writing. It makes a lot of sense. A lot of things become clearer when you kind of look at it that way. So thanks a lot for joining us. And thanks to all of you. Just want to remind you that, this conversation is going to be archived on YouTube, or for all our reservations about archives, it's going to remain there. So if anyone missed it, we can always catch it later. And thanks a lot. Wonderful. It's good to see you all, and hopefully we'll see you at the next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.